Jackie like a kid, rather than an adult. And I always think you skip forward 100 years and Jackie has just become Jacko. All that's changed in 100 years is a syllable. I do think that there's an argument to be made that race played a part. You have to consider the circumstances as well. Jack Johnson was a black champion, 50 years before segregation was lifted. Michael Jackson was a black man who owned the Beatles and outsold Elvis in an era when MTV still wouldn't even put African Americans on its TV channel. So he was a racial trailblazer. He was a pioneer in that field. And I think it would be short-sighted to state for certain that race didn't play a factor.
Well, let's fast forward to the trial that happened with the Arvizo family, and can you just put out some of those facts for us?
Oh boy, that whole trial was it would have been hilarious if it wasn't so tragic. I mean, it was a farce. The whole thing was a farce. The boy kept changing his story. He went to the police. He said he'd been molested 5 or 6 times. Then he said it was 1 or 2 times. Who can't tell the difference between being molested 1 and 6 times? That's ridiculous. You have the fact that they had all been complicit in false allegations of sexual molestation in the past. There was evidence that the children had been coached to lie on the stand in the past. They had lied for financial gain in the past. They were a family of grifters. They'd concocted these allegations that they were molested by JCPenney security staff and extorted a massive amount of money out of JCPenney. The mother took the stand and declared that the Germans. She just kept referring to the Germans, this non-specific. Oh, the Germans did it. She kept claiming that Michael Jackson and the Germans were going to abduct her children and fly them to Africa in a hot air balloon or something. The woman was just raving bonkers. The whole case didn't add up. The prosecution kept calling witnesses to testify for them who would have nothing interesting to say. Quite notably, they called what they referred to as 5 former victims of Michael Jackson. 3 of them took the stand and said, "He never touched me and I resent the implication." 1 of them took the stand and said, "Once Michael Jackson was tickling him and extremely briefly brushed against his crotch, which could easily have been accidental." And the 5th didn't even show up. The 5th was Jordan Chandler, who he by this point had gained legal emancipation from his parents. His mother took the stand and testified that she hadn't heard from him in 11 years. And he actually left the country. Thomson wanted him to testify against Michael Jackson, but Jordan Chandler left the country rather than do that. And had he taken the stand, Thomas Mesereau, Michael Jackson's lawyer, had several witnesses lined up who were prepared to testify that in recent years Jordan Chandler had insisted that Jackson never touched him and that he hated his parents for making him say that he had, and that was why he gained legal emancipation. So even these 5 former victims turned out to be a completely farcical move on behalf of the prosecution. Then you had this hilarious conspiracy charge where they tried to prove that Michael Jackson had tried to kidnap the boy. They claimed that he'd held the boy and his family captive at Neverland, even though logs showed that the family had been entering and exiting Neverland of their own accord all the time. They'd been making phone calls to whoever they wanted. The whole thing, it just didn't make sense. All of these charges, they had no evidence whatsoever to support any of their charges, and they were caught trying to plant evidence, which is often brushed over by the media. During the grand jury testimony before the trial, Thomas Snedden brought out some girly magazines that had been found at Michael Jackson's house. And they were not wrapped up in anything. They were not in plastic bags. They were not in evidence bags. And he handed them the kids on the stand and said, "Is this the magazine that you saw at Jackson's house? Do you remember seeing this magazine?" And then he took those magazines after he'd handed them to the kids on the stand and he sent them for fingerprint analysis, and they found the kids' fingerprints on them, which of course they would, because they'd just handled them in court. He tried to brush over that. That evidence was not admitted in the end because it was realized that the fingerprints had been put on the magazines afterwards. But he took those magazines and he gave them to the kids on the stand, and then he sent them off for fingerprint analysis to see if their kids' fingerprints were on them, which is a blatant example of the prosecution trying to plant evidence against Michael Jackson. That is how feeble their case was.
And it's quite interesting to note that there were over 2,000 so-called journalists covering the trial. It was a circus outside the courtroom, yet day by day they would not report what actually went on in the courtroom. You want to talk about that?
Well, if even just hearing that number, 2,000 journalists, that courtroom did not hold 2,000 journalists. The courtroom would barely have held 100 journalists, because that's the size of the courtroom. The courtroom is not designed to hold many people. So you have 2,000 journalists stood outside the courtroom reporting on this trial, and only 100 of them, if that, have actually been inside. That's the level of reporting that you had about this trial. Thomas Mesereau was dismayed. He was completely dismayed. He would go home at the end of the day, he said in a couple of interviews afterwards, having had a really successful day in court. And he would switch on court TV and there would be a panel of supposed experts who were not even inside the courtroom, giving their analysis, giving their comments, making these allegations about the day in court that they had not even witnessed, they had not even been there. The trial was poorly covered for that reason. It was, you have 2,000 journalists vying for seats inside a courtroom that probably holds about 100 people tops. And that is why the reporting on the trial was so poor. And it's also why Aphrodite Jones's book is so good, because she was actually given a permanent seat for every day of the trial. Her book, Michael Jackson, Conspiracy, kind of reveals the side of the trial that we were never told about. The positive days, which, when we read about them, were turned into negative days. The positive testimony that by the time they reached us was turned into negative testimony. She gives you the facts. She tells you in her book what really happened inside the courtroom, and the fact that she was actually inside plays a big part in that. It's just absurd. It's absurd to have these 2,000 journalists claiming that they're covering a trial when they're not even inside the courtroom. What are they even doing? Just standing around outside the courtroom. It's just absurd.
And in fact, she had a change of conscience. She started out being one of those accusers and had an epiphany experience, realizing he wasn't guilty. And you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I actually interviewed Aphrodite Jones back when her book came out. That was in 2008, and I wrote a piece about it. And she told me that the reason she had presumed Jackson was guilty was because she arrived at the trial late. She arrived a couple of days late because she'd been off covering another big trial, the Scott Peterson trial or something. And so when she got there, she asked the rest of the press to kind of, what's been going on, can you bring me up to date? And they were all kind of laboring under this illusion that Jackson was obviously guilty because of the 93 settlement. They all walked into the trial wanting Jackson to be guilty and believing that he was guilty, and so they allowed that to skew their reporting on the trial. If you watch the trial through those eyes, then you will pick out the little sound bites that you think support that theory. It's kind of natural, I suppose. It's just the way your brain works. And then her moment of epiphany actually came on verdict day. The verdict had been read, and she was live on Fox News via a satellite link. And Bill O'Reilly asked her, do you think they made the right decision? And in that moment, she said she thought about it, and she just thought about the evidence and the testimony, and she said, well, Bill, I have to say yes, I think they did. And in that moment, she completely reevaluated her stance on the Jackson trial. And And that's when she went off and started researching her book, which is very good. I really do recommend it. Michael Jackson, Conspiracy by Aphrodite Jones.
And it's interesting to note also that when all those not guilty verdicts came in, they were never examined by those 2,000